So today is February the 4th, 2021, and I'm Victor Schoenbach, and I have the great privilege and honor of recording an interview with Van Sizar Allen, who was one of the first African Americans to earn a graduate degree at the UNC, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill School of Public Health, now the Gilling School of Global Public Health. So, Van, I am so honored and grateful to you for taking the time to do this interview with me and doing all the preparations. So, thank you. And I've got a list of questions, as you know, that I was going to go through.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity.
So, I want to focus on your time at the University of North Carolina School of Public Health. But first, I want to hear about some things about your experience growing up in Mississippi, your family, your school years, and your Tougaloo College years. Just say, let's take a few minutes, 5 minutes, and tell me some of your story.
I'm a native Mississippian, the son of sharecropper family, the oldest of 9 children. I went to school in Mississippi from elementary through high school. My first school building was a small Baptist church. The school's name was Little Rock Missionary Baptist Church. It was a Baptist church school on the backside of a plantation. We, at that time, we were talking about 1931, 32, living on the plantation, walked to and from school. I'm remembering that even at that early time, white children who lived in rural communities were bused to schools in our local town, Hollandale, Mississippi. And one of the youth activities that we Black kids experienced in that mode of transportation was the white kids would collect rocks before entering their buses. And when they would pass us walking to school, they would throw rocks at us. And as I think back on it, somehow or another, it was not irritating. It was a kind of fun thing in our response to their throwing rocks. But in preparing to make this presentation, in thinking about those days, that was one of the things I remembered right off. I finished high school in Hollandale, Mississippi, and 6 months later, I was drafted into the Navy, World War II. I had training at Bainbridge, Maryland. I served in the Navy in sites from Newport, Connecticut, Panama Canal Zone, Hawaii, Okinawa, Shanghai, China. The Navy service experience provided me with the GI Bill, which program paid your college cost if you were a veteran and if you had enough time in the Navy or the Army or whatever force you were in. The Army, Navy, Air Force would pay your tuition. So that is how I was able to go to Tougaloo College after finishing my stint in the Navy. While at Tougaloo, I met some of the first white people who did not generate in me a feeling of uncertainty and concern, in that they reached out to me in a friendly context and gave me reasons to believe that they respected my Black humanity as they respected their own. And it turned out that I was a pretty good biology student. And my teacher, who headed up the biology department for the college, in my junior year, asked the president to make me her assistant, student assistant in the laboratory. And this produced a situation that gave me close and continuous contact with this teacher. And during that period, this teacher, who was a woman in her early 60s, Anglo from Colorado, fell and broke her arm. And a part of my responsibility became, upon her recovery, it was my responsibility to walk with her from her residence to the classroom and back until she felt strong enough to do this alone. Well, during that experience, my classmates gave me a nickname. I was known then, and even today, those who are still living and we get together, they'll ask me, how is Brummies Boy? I was known as Brummies Boy.
What was her name?
Florence M. Brumbach.
Florence M. Brumbach. Okay.
Yeah. And so in this process, she, without my knowing about it, contacted her uncle, C. Judson Herrick, who had been the dean of medicine at the University of Chicago. He had left Chicago, and at this time he was associated with the University of Michigan. But she wrote him, she showed me the letter after this happened, and asked him about information that would tell her about opportunities for Black students for going to graduate school. And it turned out that at that time, he had just been appointed to a newly formed foundation, the John Hay Whitney Opportunity Fellowship Program. And so he responded positively to his niece. She was his niece. And she in turn followed through with the directions he gave her and did the application, and without my knowing anything about it. And at a particular point in the last semester that I was at Tougaloo, the fellowship program accepted her application to grant me a scholarship to go to whatever graduate school I could get into and I wanted to.
Wow.
So with Dr. Herrick, being a faculty person at the University of Michigan, that seemed to me a right move to utilize that experience to apply to the University of Michigan. And I was accepted to the University of Michigan and earned an MS degree from the University of Michigan. A story I don't tell about the University of Michigan's experience was that I actually flunked out the first semester. The grades I made were not good. And as I think back on it, the atmosphere, the academic atmosphere, was not helpful at all because, number one, Black students were scarce, usually one in a class, whatever the class was, and you didn't interact. The few who were there didn't interact with each other. And a part of that was, of course, due to this, how classes are scheduled and the fact we didn't live in the same communities and so forth. But I noted at that time that other ethnic group students who were on the campus and in the classes tended to gather together at the end of a class. They would rush together and exchange thoughts and questions and so forth. And being an only Black and not being included in those groups, I discovered later that I missed a lot of what students coming out of my experience would have to have and would do better if they had it in the particular setting they were being educated in. One of the end products of that experience was I don't remember any of my white classmates. I couldn't, if they identified themselves to me, I wouldn't recognize them because the environment was not conducive. I also found that looking back and having had much more experience, that the university was not prepared to serve us Black students. They did not provide what was needed for students who had come through the kind of earlier educational training and experiences we had. And hence they had good intentions in that they wanted to serve Black students, but they were not prepared to serve them. And what became more significant as I increased in understanding of life and experiences was the fact that there were no models of us Black people in any of the roles that we were accustomed to in the experiences we were having. Therefore, at that time, it wasn't nearly so understood how important it is for an ethnic group person to see one of his own ethnicity in the role of teacher, in the role, whatever you're striving to become. Every ethnic group person ought to see examples of himself ethnically in those roles, because it just didn't even occur to me earlier that that was an important part of the motivational thing that all of us need. If I might refer back to an earlier time with Professor Brumback, when Professor Brumback asked the president to make me her lab assistant, and I started doing that job, it started occurring to me, I can become a college professor. Example, and a willingness to encourage me. I hadn't even thought about becoming a college teacher. Not had thought very little about being an elementary or high school teacher, but a college teacher, wow. So those experiences were extremely important, and they have served me well through the rest of my life and work experiences. Let's see.
Let me ask you to interrupt for a second. So you got the scholarship to go to University of Michigan in the spring of 1950, is that correct?
Right,
And that was the year you graduated from Tougaloo College?
right,
And then
right,
you were in at University of Michigan for 50 to 51 and 51 to 52.
right.
And what years were you in you were born in 1920,
19,
26?
uh-huh.
And then what years were you in the Navy?
44 to 46.
Oh, 44 to 46. Okay.
Mhm. I finished high school, 44.
And then
6 months later, Navy, and Tougaloo after that.
mhm. That is fascinating, I have to say, absolutely fascinating. Now, did you, I know you went to Bennett College next to be on the faculty,
Right.
but I wondered, I didn't put in the interview anything about, and the outline, anything about whether you got married at some point or had children or, so I wonder when that comes in.
The marriage bit came in at the end of my Tougaloo experience. That was one of the crowning experience of my stay at Tougaloo. My wife, yeah, we got married, and she was at the University of Michigan with me.
What was her name?
Perlina Allen, Perlina Briscoe Allen. She was a Briscoe, and she had matriculated at Dillard University in New Orleans.
Mhm.
And at the time I came to Tougaloo, she had transferred from Dillard to Tougaloo
Ah.
because of the loss of her mother.
Oh.
And that's where I met her at Tougaloo. And she was the only female interest that I had while I was at Tougaloo. We struck it off right away. And so she was with me during my University of Michigan stay. And we were undergirded by the presence of my father's youngest brother who lived in Detroit. And that's where we spent our weekends. They would come over and pick us up from the university housing where we were. And we would spend the weekend with them. And they had children my age who were in school in the Detroit area. But that uncle and aunt were really, in fact, I suspect we probably would not have survived without having had that resource, because it was such a change from the Mississippi environment and the challenge of being caught up in an academic setting where the people who, though they meant well, their understanding of what our needs were not there. But that was always a rejuvenating experience to go and get some down home cooking.
And love.
Yes, yes.
What were their names? Their name, your uncle and aunt's names?
Chester Allen. And incidentally, his son, he had a son, is Lenny Thompson, representative from the state of Mississippi.
Really?
Yeah,
My
he was the
goodness.
chairman of the Democratic Committee, election committee this year. That Lenny Thompson. Uh-huh.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm speechless. So you then went back to my question. So you then joined the faculty at Bennett.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes. After the Michigan experience. However, let me just slip this in there. I learned to be an auto assembly person.
A what?
Auto assembly line operator at the Willow Run Kaiser Fraser automobile plant. That was my job between the time I finished Michigan at the end of the first semester. So I learned about manufacturing of automobile.
What were you assembling? What?
The Kaiser Fraser automobile maker.
So that was the whole assembly line? I don't know much about how automobile assembly works.
That it came on, and I don't know what year they just continued making it, but it was pretty popular for a couple of years anyway. But I keep forgetting that I had that experience.
That's terrific. That is terrific. So why did you leave that to go to Bennett College?
Well, when I knew I was finishing, I put out an application to the Black colleges because the opportunities that were publicized for Blacks to work at historically white institutions were non-existent at that time. But I put out applications. Bennett was one of the schools that responded, and they even went so far as to set up an interview schedule for me. And I was to meet them in Detroit for this interview. In the meantime, after I agreed to show up for the interview, I was invited by my alma mater, the president of our alma mater, to come and teach in their summer school. And the college at that time served a lot of the teachers in the public school system in Mississippi, because like my teachers in the first grade, second grade, my teachers had high school diplomas and what they called, what did they call it? It was a 6-week teacher training experience that you had to have in addition to college graduation in order to qualify for a teaching position.
In addition to college or in addition to high school?
High school.
In addition to high school, you got 6 weeks additional training, but not college.
Qualified you to teach in Mississippi. And my first 2 teachers had those type training levels. Well, the pressure was on that group of teachers at the time I finished to upgrade the training. So I ended up in that experience teaching some of my teachers from elementary school.
I hope they appreciated that and enjoyed it.
The significance of it, no, but the significance of what was happening didn't occur to me until years later. Here I am. But that's what happened. But the other part of the Tula story, or the Bennett College story, was I was invited to do this job at my alma mater. So I wrote and told them that I was sorry, but I had been invited to do this, and I was going to opt out of the interview. So they told me, he said, well, we aren't going to take you off our list. So I said, okay. So when I went to work at the Tugler that summer, I got a call from Bennett, and the call was to inform me that they had decided to take me sight unseen. So I never was interviewed for the first job. Now, another part of this experience that I'm sure played some kind of role in this, the person in charge of academic affairs, Dr. Willoughby Player, was from Mississippi. She had gone to school in Jackson, Mississippi, at one of the schools that I was familiar with. And she was a very successful academic person, so much so that she had studied in Paris. She had a certification in French and all kinds of stuff, And so when I showed up at Bennett, I was assigned teaching biology and certain health courses. And Bennett had a community outreach program, which had its objective familiarizing their students with the community in which they lived, working with tenant family groups and tenant group organizations. They did things like participate in registering, getting people registered to vote, tutoring students.
This was in the 1950s?
Yes, sir.
Wow.
Yes. So I was immediately drawn to that program. And so I initiated organizing tenant councils in the public housing community. And this meant, again, getting to know the tenants, sitting down with groups of tenants to discuss problems that were occurring, working out solutions and so forth. At that time, the University of North Carolina and some other universities were in the practice of sending their students in public health, sociology, and other disciplines like that to places like Greensboro to have field experiences where they were introduced to low-income families and the problem in the community and so forth. Well, I was sort of in charge of Bennett's program in that context. And this introduced me to the students and the faculty people who supervised those students. That's how I came to know about the University of North Carolina. And in that relationship, they informed me about this public health traineeship program, and that's why I got the first the MPH from the University of North Carolina. The work that I was doing, were coming to experience the impact of the work I was doing, and to the point that they saw this opportunity and brought it to my attention. And that's why Julian Lewis and I came together at that time.
Did you know Julian before you got to UNC?
No, we met there.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't realize that I had not thought about it, but then we had so little connection that we were the first two. That was when I read that, I said, what?
I think you were the first two in the whole school, actually.
Yeah.
First two African Americans in the whole school, and the only ones there in 61, 62.
I knew when I tried to think about who else was there Black, I couldn't think of anybody. Well, in any event, that was that was one of the things that got my attention about UNC. They, anytime in the national, certainly statewide news vehicles, noted invariably when something went awry in terms of human relations in the state, somebody at the University of North Carolina would have something to say that was positive about what was, they would, if it was something wrong, they criticized it and so forth. And the university had a reputation of being liberal. In fact, they had to live down a communist thing. They were still living that down when I went there. At the University of North Carolina's communist. Because, and that was the basic motivation for that definition of university. They said, no, that's wrong, we shouldn't do that. And so with that experience.
Now, the students you met from North Carolina, from the university, when you were doing the work with the housing in Greensboro, they were white students, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the ones from UNC.
I remember about a Black student in the group.
Do you remember any of the white students' names? I mean, did you form relationships with them or?
No, I don't remember any. There were a couple of Indian students from India who were part of that group of students, but no Blacks. And I understand that better now. That there was no whatever we call this thing that happens between human beings who understand each other.
Rapport?
Yeah.
Rapport?
It was not there. It was, I find it difficult to even describe the relationship, the nature of the relationship that existed between us. But as I have said earlier, I understand better why, if you are taught, if that's what you are taught, I don't care what the world says, that's how
you couldn't even use the same drinking fountains then, right?
At that time, yes. At the time of this experience.
I mean, in the 50s, it was still.
Well, in the earlier part of 50s. Well, again, University of North Carolina was looked on by a lot of the more conservatives as communists. If a white person stood up for the rights of a Black person, that was one of the first labels they would put on. And so, but there was always somebody in there who left you with the idea that university is on the right track. They would criticize the stuff that was wrong, and none of the other schools were saying anything. And so they
the Greensboro sit-ins in the lunch counters.
Yeah.
That was in the early 60s, right?
Yeah.
So you couldn't have lunch with any of those students who were coming from Chapel Hill.
Well, in Chapel Hill, you could. That was the thing about Chapel Hill then.
In many places now, I guess. I don't know, but I know there were still sit-ins in the 60s in Chapel Hill at some of the lunch counters.
Well, but there were businesses in Chapel Hill that let Blacks in. And I'm pretty certain that was influenced in large measure by the people, Chapel Hill. And so many of the people who were in business, that was home for them. And that was a different attitude, very different attitude. They were a very different place. I felt, I didn't feel the same things I felt at the University of North Carolina, where the institution was going to, Michigan was, how do I say this? The atmosphere where the Black-white relationship was concerned was distant. You know, it was standoffish kind of thing that caused you to feel that I better try to learn how to do this thing myself, because nobody's going to come to my aid or rescue if I get in trouble with it. And so that, even though it was in the North, see, that was in the North. All of us in the South knew the North was a different place. And it turned out it was different, but the difference did not nullify the presence of an attitude that rejected the individual, Black individuals in particular. So it was, the whole thing was just, as I look back on it.
So looking back on your, so you got to Chapel Hill, you entered the School of Public Health, Department of Health Education. You and Julian were the only two Black students, graduate students in the school. How were the classes? How did you meet with him after the classes to find out to talk, or?
No, and there are a couple of reasons that occurred to me as I was thinking back over it last night. All of us, for the most part, were graduate students. All of us had families, and they didn't have time to linger after class. They were going to the next class, and after that, they were going home to. So there wasn't the time you have in an undergraduate setting where you were living on the campus. You didn't have family obligations and so forth. I'm sure that would have been one of the excuses that the students of that time would have shared if the question had been asked. But in settings where there was more Black students, for example, going back to the Michigan experience, when I would see these Indian students who were in the class, when they come out of the class, instead of they would stop, sit down together. Michigan had benches outside of the classroom, and many times a group would just sit down together there, and they would be talking with each other. And there weren't but maybe two Blacks in there.
There were two.
Yeah,
Small bench.
About 1950.
Well, 1950, at UNC, there were a few undergraduates, I think.
Yeah.
And maybe a few medical students, but no School of Public Health in the 1950s.
Yeah.
No Black students.
Yeah.
And two in 1961, 62, and two, I think, in 62, 63, or maybe it was four, because I look back, there were about two students getting a degree every year. There were two Black students getting a degree every year in the 60s, until about 67, I think it goes up then.
Is that
four?
Wow.
Yeah, I've got the numbers. I was just looking at a list. In fact, I was going to share the names with you, see how many of them you knew.
Yeah, the Green, my student Green,
Bernice.
Yeah.
Bernice Green of Otedeco.
I said, oh, wow, I didn't know, because our time at the university was different. So I didn't get to know them at all.
Though she was your student at Bennett, as we found out.
Yeah, but I was thinking of the campus, the Chapel Hill campus.
Yes.
Period. but I was glad to make the reacquaintance. She seems to be quite active.
She is. She's a real power.
Yeah.
So I was looking back at the names of the students who were in the school then. There was one named Orville Blake.
What
He
year?
graduated the year after you, health education.
I never met him.
And John Campbell.
Yeah, I remember the name Campbell.
He was
Yeah.
also in your department and came a year later, or graduated a year later. And Frances Perkins, or Vines. Her name is Frances Perkins Vines, and I don't know whether it's a maiden name or not.
Very faint. But see, we didn't have the relationships where you became acquainted with somebody who was behind you. But I attribute that to the nature of the classes. Usually, the relationships I have even with the Tougaloo people who were with me are people I had established relationships with while going through those 4 years. And anybody who came behind, I know only by reputation to what somebody has told me. If you don't have that personal knowledge about a person you really know in part, and just the name doesn't leave you much to hold on to. But if the guy had a reputation for doing certain things, you remember.
So you do remember Bill Dougherty?
Oh, yes.
What was it? So he had a reputation?
Yes, for being scholarly, challenging the professors. I remember he did a paper on something, and the professor ripped his paper up, and he challenged him. And he had to change his. He definitely he was really my mentor when I was there for the master's degree program. And Bill and I kept in touch over the years. In fact, when he went to the University of Massachusetts, he invited me to consider coming there to be employed in their school of health. And I went up for the interview and all, and I don't remember what kind of decision was made on it. I didn't get the job. But yeah, these other environments didn't provide that kind of opportunity to come to know people. And so the memory of persons beyond the handful as a rule, it isn't very good.
But Edward Ellis is someone else that you remember?
Yes. I don't remember Ed as well as I do Bill, because we didn't have the same kind of interaction experiences. But Bill and I knew each other's families and visited each other, that kind of thing. And